Hello all and welcome to the State of Our Society. We're going to give folks just a couple minutes to get settled in. We're so excited to have you joining us this evening. As we are waiting for folks to join, if you want to share your name and where you're joining us from in the chat, that's located at the bottom of your screen. Would appreciate knowing where folks are, where you're tuning in from this evening. And then also at the bottom of your screen, you'll also see a Q&A pod. Feel free to share any questions that you have with our speakers at any time throughout our conversation this evening. So definitely feel free to let us know where you're joining from, and we'll just get started in one moment. Welcome. I am Krista Leinbach, Director, Penn Traditions, Student and Young Alumni Programming. We are thrilled to have you here with us this evening for the State of Our Society, a two-part program focused on social justice and geared towards our YPenn, our Young Penn alumni. This conversation kicks off this evening with a faculty discussion featuring Dr. Jaleel Bishop and Dr. Dorothy Roberts. We continue the conversation on October 1st with a call to action program. This event series is hosted by YPenn and also Penn Spectrum programs. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Michaela Reynolds, who is our host and moderator for this evening. Michaela is college 18, law 23. She graduated in 2018 with a bachelor's degree in health and societies with concentrations in healthcare markets and finance. She serves as the class president for the class of 2018 and was involved in Active Minds Penn, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, community school sponsored partnerships, and Sell to Home. After graduating, Michaela taught 4th grade in Tulsa, Oklahoma with Teach for America. Michaela just returned to Penn and Philadelphia this summer to start law school, where she currently is a Toll Public Interest Scholar. Michaela was a driving force behind the series, and I want to acknowledge her and all of her work in turning this idea into a reality. Michaela?
Thank you, Krista. So part one of the State of Our Society focuses on a faculty discussion around race and inequity. We will be hosting a fireside chat with our two faculty guests. At the end of our time together, we will have an opportunity to take an audience Q&A, so please share in the Q&A pod any questions that you have throughout the event. It is my pleasure to introduce our two faculty guests this evening, Dr. Dorothy Roberts, George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights, and Dr. Jaleel Bishop, Vice Provost Postdoctoral Scholar of Higher Education at the Graduate School of Education. Dr. Bishop joined the Higher Education Division in 2018 as a Vice Provost Postdoctoral Scholar and Lecturer. Dr. Bishop used mixed methods to understand lived experiences and introduce uncommon connections to the field of education. His research agenda and teaching focus on how the education pathways are structured through race, class, and place, and the ways marginalized Black communities challenge and build power. Currently, he is affiliated with the Hub for Equity, Anti-Oppression, Research and Development, and the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy at Penn GSE. Dr. Roberts, an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and the law, joined the University of Pennsylvania as its 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor, with joint appointments in the Departments of Africana Studies and Sociology and the Law School, where she holds the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Chair. She is also founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. Her path-breaking work in law and public policy focuses on urgent contemporary issues in health, social justice, and bioethics, especially as they impact the lives of women, children, and African Americans. Her major books include Fatal Intervention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. She is the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as a co-editor of 6 books on such topics as constitutional law and women in the law. Dr. Bishop and Dr. Roberts, we are thrilled to have you here with us tonight, and thank you for taking the time out of your schedule as we think about the state of our society and our role in making positive change. So, thinking about the state of our country with civil unrest concerning poverty, racism, police brutality, Dr. Roberts, how do you think these issues affect our society during the pandemic?
Well, they are a reflection of issues that have been present in US society for centuries. We can trace some of the issues that are being protested about today back to the institution of slavery. So policing, we can trace back to slave patrols. Some of the issues that I've been working on are the overrepresentation of Black people in what's called the child welfare system. I call it a family policing system, which is connected to policing and prisons in America. And again, we can trace the roots of that system back to enslavement and throughout the time after that to ways in which Black Americans have been devalued. A lot of my work has to do with reproductive justice as well, and the longstanding control of Black women's childbearing, and currently devaluation of our childbearing decisions. Again, all connected, all forms of policing that have existed, again, from the time of slavery to today in various manifestations. And so what we're seeing now is uprisings having to do with police violence, with prisons. And you mentioned the pandemic. It's all related to the pandemic as well, because we're seeing that Black Americans are up to 3 times, depending on the particular location, 2, 3, 4, even 5 times more likely to be infected and to die from COVID. And that reflects these structural inequities that have existed over the centuries that are maintained by forms of white supremacy and structural racism, like segregated housing that results from federal and other policies, lack of access to health care, extra exposure to toxins in the environment, less equal education systems, and bias in the medical system as well, both in terms of access to medical care, but also in terms of the way that Black patients are treated within the healthcare system. And that's in the context of a society that doesn't provide adequate healthcare, education, income distribution to everyone, and is especially harmful to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So everything that we're seeing today in terms of protests against police violence, against mass incarceration, against lack of health care can be traced to these forms of structural inequality that have been reproduced over and over again in different forms in the United States.
Thank you. And Dr. Bishop, how do you think the pandemic will affect education outcomes specifically? I know Dr. Roberts spoke a little bit about police brutality and racism and just the history of structural systems that are unequal towards Black Americans. What about education?
So I think echoing what Dr. Roberts just shared, is important for us to realize that the pandemic is really highlighting, again, these already pre-existing issues of racism and structural inequality and systemic violence that have been in society. And again, that's not just in education, but in the ways that education intersects with healthcare issues, with income inequality, housing, food insecurity, and so on. So it's really important to understand that racism was already here prior to the pandemic, and that the pandemic is really a highlight or a light that's shining on that issue. So when we think about the education context, I often, tell my students and in my writing and publications is that racism shapes not only the problems that we kind of report data around, but it also shapes our solutions. So often we believe that in order to address these many different issues around racism, we should turn to the education system as kind of this silver bullet, where if we can allow particularly Black people or poor folks to be included into the education system, is going to be this type of social equalizer. So what happens in that type of logic or that type of solution put forth is that we're mistaking a system that's a part of reproducing racism and has always been a part of reproducing that racism as somehow being the answer without that very system going through some type of transformation. And so education, what we're seeing already happen in the pandemic, we're seeing the issues that already existed around racial inequality within K-12 and higher ed be intensified. And to just make that clear, we're seeing in K-12 issues where students who are already dealing with basic needs insecurities back home, that's becoming highlighted now that the classroom has become virtual and they're learning from their home environments. We're seeing things around the digital gap. We're seeing issues around even students in their home environment having the police called on them, because if you haven't heard the story, there was a story of a young child who showed a Nerf gun on their virtual classroom, and the teacher reported to the police, and the police showed up to the home. So even in their own home space, there's a type of policing that's going on right now. There's a type of policing around students being absent from K-12, where we're even in the moment of a pandemic with all these unpredictable factors, there's this type of policing that's being reproduced on students in K-12. And then in higher education, we have a higher ed system that I won't go into now, but let's just say it has been underfunded, particularly for public institutions for years now. And the pandemic may be the blow that kind of brings down this fragile house of cards that has existed. Not so much for an institution like Penn, but very much for nearby institutions like the Community College of Philadelphia or Temple University, where they're seeing a hit right now with not being able to rely on state funding or full enrollment and tuition dollars and so on. So we're seeing institutions having to figure out more and more how to come up with different revenue streams, which unfortunately often means a shift away from prioritizing students to thinking about how do we, kind of act like businesses? How do we privatize to come up with these new revenue streams? And on top of that, what that means is that the burden of paying for higher ed is going to increasingly fall on students, meaning that we're going to continue to see what's happening with the student debt crisis, where Black people are by far being impacted the most by kind of carrying these high costs of higher education. And what we saw in the last recession during 2008 was that there was a major increase in higher ed enrollment, but particularly at for-profit institutions, which often are more expensive and have some of the worst outcomes. But they also have an overrepresentation of students of color. So we have to really be, I think, just immediate about paying attention to the lessons from the past to understand how that's going to get reproduced in a higher ed and K-12 system that already is rampant with racism, but now has been hit with a blow of the pandemic.
Definitely. And with these current trends that you speak about, what trends are you seeing across campuses related to student activism around some of these issues?
Well, I think what's interesting right now is that with the virtual environment, I think, and also the racial uprisings that's been happening before campuses open back up, you're seeing a lot of the activism take place really in this more at the intersection of the community and campus. So there's not, just a silo of what are students doing on campus or responding to a campus incident, but really you're seeing a larger movement of students and community members responding to just the repeated killing and devaluement of Black life that we all have been, witnesses to through viral videos, but also through the justified reaction of Black communities rising up and pushing back and trying to assert that their life has value, and without that justice for our lives, that there won't be peace, and there will be a disruption and a pushback that may come through burning buildings, that may come through protests, marches, whatever it may be. But I think that campus activism in a lot of situations right now is joining in with a larger kind of just community activism that's pushing back against violence coming from every direction.
Definitely, and I think one aspect that's really been highlighted is just the use in technology in student activism, and just the ability to congregate on something like Zoom, an event like this. So I think although campuses might be closed, I'm very just impressed and inspired by just the work that people are putting in to make sure that their voices are still being heard. So Dr. Roberts, you speak about the challenges that Black mothers face. Could you elaborate on some of those challenges and maybe talk a little bit about how those are exacerbated through the pandemic?
Yeah, so let me focus on a couple or maybe three aspects, and it shows how these forms of structural racism are all related together in ways in which these systems intersect with each other. So one is, as I mentioned before, the regulation of Black women's childbearing, which goes back to enslavement, where enslaved women were forced to have children who were treated as the property of enslavers. But after slavery ended, and this happened during a time also when the ideology of eugenics was rising in the United States, the idea that the state should have policies that deter or even prohibit certain people from having children through sterilization, for example, that Black women became a target for government policies to deter them from having so many children, and the idea that Black women's childbearing caused social problems became very prominent. And that's an idea that continues today and shapes public policy around public assistance, for example. That's a nutshell of that aspect of it. And, I work closely with a rising reproductive justice movement led by Black women and other women of color to create a new way of thinking about reproductive freedom that connects it to social injustice and that ensures that everyone has value and is able to make decisions about their own bodies, and that takes into account social inequities as well as government interference. So that's one aspect of it. Another topic that affects Black mothers is, as I mentioned before, family policing, or what we call the child welfare system or child protective services. They have disproportionately targeted Black mothers for policing, for surveillance, for taking children away from them and placing them in foster care, group homes, and juvenile detention. And, it's interesting, Dr. Bishop mentioned the case of a child who had a Nerf gun and the police were called on him. There's also a case involving a Black teenage girl who didn't complete her assignments in time and was sent to juvenile detention. And part of that is the idea that Black mothers, especially Black single mothers, aren't able to supervise their children properly. There's a long history of devaluing myths about Black mothers, that Black mothers are sexually promiscuous, that they have babies just to get a government check, that they cause dysfunction in the family, that they reproduce recklessly, all of these stereotypes that have shaped public policy. And then there's welfare policy that where the myth of the Black welfare queen fueled a campaign to end the federal entitlement to welfare, and other ways in which people have received public assistance that was seen as an entitlement. And all of that was abolished so that states have power to really have a kind of behavior modification system that's targeted at Black mothers. And then finally, high rates of incarceration of Black mothers. Black mothers are the fastest growing group of incarcerated people in the United States, in a system that has more incarcerated people than anywhere in the world, at the highest rates ever for any Western democracy, and even more than apartheid South Africa and the gulags in the Soviet Union. I mean, it's just totally inhumane and astronomical. And Black mothers are a significant segment of that population. And all of these policies that treat Black mothers with disrespect, that devalue our bodies and our decisions, work together. Again, whether we're talking about reproductive health policy or welfare policy, child welfare policy, and prison policy, it is actually the same mothers who are being targeted by these policies and blamed for what's actually structural inequality that causes these burdens on their children. It's not because they're bad mothers. It's because of some of the inequalities that Dr. Bishop mentioned. But what many policies do are blame these mothers for it, so that attention is diverted from the structural change that needs to take place. And instead, these mothers are targeted for policing and various kinds of punishment.
Thank you.
Oh, and you asked me, let me just briefly say, because you asked me about how that relates to the pandemic. And I'll just say that the pandemic has pushed many low-income Black mothers into dangerous work without proper protections because of inequalities of wealth and income in the United States, and the way in which jobs are racially and gender segregated, and Black mothers tend to have the most dangerous jobs with the least pay, and they are forced into the workplace without adequate protections. And so you end up with these mothers who have to juggle being able to educate their kids, take care of them at a time when they're also much more vulnerable to poverty, to food insecurity, to housing insecurity. I mean, it's a seriously emergency, urgent situation for many Black mothers in the United States right now because of this convergence of the pandemic. But, you know, as Dr. Bishop said, already existing structural inequalities that are just exacerbated by the pandemic.
And Michaela, if I could jump in real quick, I think this ties in, you know, right here in Philadelphia, is that, you know, Philadelphia right now is having this battle over whether they're going to continue eviction relief. And most of the people who face evictions in this city are Black and brown mothers. And when they are evicted and they try to go to homeless shelters that are at capacity, eventually, excuse me, I'm sorry, eventually, if they go to those homeless shelters and they're at capacity, if they show up too many times, that also is a automatic trigger for them to be reported to Children's Services. So there's these constant kind of intersections of these systems and policies that are just repeatedly enforcing policing and displacement, I think on the Black family, but particularly, as Dr. Roberts laid out, on Black single mothers.
Thank you to you both. So Dr. Roberts, you spoke a little bit about your views on the foster care system. I'm curious about this view and about maybe alternatives that you would advocate for.
Yeah, so I am an abolitionist when it comes to foster care, as I am about prisons and policing. The foster care system and the whole child welfare or child protective system is a system that is based on the idea that the way to deal with struggling families' problems is to take their children away from them or threaten to take their children away from them. Most of the money that's spent on so-called child protective services goes to foster care, not to services that and other material resources that families need. And so I think what we need to do is reverse that. Instead of focusing on separating children from their families as a way to deal with families' human needs, we should be providing for those human needs. And this would require some really radical changes in a lot of what we've been talking about today. You know, if we had a society that had adequate housing for everybody, food for everybody, income for everybody, education for everybody, healthcare for everybody, which we could have in this rich nation we live in, there would be no need for foster care. And our child welfare system should be about providing for the welfare of children and families, not a brutal, violent system that relies on taking children away from their families and policing families. So as with prison abolition, it's both dismantling the racist and sexist and homophobic and classist and discrimination against people with disabilities and all of these unequal structures. It's about dismantling that, but equally important is envisioning a different kind of society where these unjust structures just wouldn't exist. No one would see a need for them. And that's what we need to work toward, a society where all of these injustices we've been talking about no longer exist, and we don't need to rely on punitive structures like policing and prisons and foster care.
Great. And speaking about some of these changes, and we speak about, you know, the structural inequities that our society is facing, how do you think, Dr. Bishop, how can young alumni kind of use a critical lens to analyze this racism and the biases that are in our society?
Well, I think kind of a simple starting point that I like to walk people through is that it's not enough, especially in today's society, to just think that racism is wrong or to say that Black Lives Matter, that it really matters why you think racism is wrong or why you think Black Lives Matter, and then what solutions are you willing to be in solidarity around, what solutions are you willing to support. And that's important because so many of the policies and structural racism that we have named, they have often been reproduced in the name of actually being anti-racist or trying to bring about justice or trying to achieve equality for these different racial groups. So it's not enough just to say Black Lives Matter. You have to see that as an action that's situated in a structural analysis, that's situated in solidarity with the people who are actually experiencing this racial oppression and this racial violence. So that, and those type of things won't make sure that they don't guarantee that you're going to be completely where you need to be, but they put you on a better path to have a racial analysis that's aligned with correctly framing the problems and deeply understanding what the solutions are. I think another piece, and this is, really particular for young alumni, is often, and I don't know if this is because of the training of coming out of a university like Penn, or if it's because of just, how we're positioned in society, but people are often very obsessed with getting data around an issue and kind of wading into the evidence is there. And I like to kind of think of data as we're already too late, meaning that when we have data that shows us the outcomes of what has happened to a racial group, it was already happened. Someone has lived through that, they have experienced it, they have endured that racism. And I'm not saying data is not important. I'm not saying that it doesn't make things evident, but we also have to be willing to move and be in solidarity and do things that are bold and urgent, even if we don't feel like all the data and numbers and things add up. Because even when they do, these issues still persist. So a lot of what the work has to be is not just studying issues better or reading more about them, but how do you get connected and in solidarity with the communities that are experiencing them?
And what are some ways that young alumni can do that?
So a lot of this for me is really thinking about where are you at locally. So I guarantee, and I would bet my small postdoc paycheck on this, that in whatever community you are in, there are people who are already doing this work. And they didn't start this work during the pandemic. They didn't start it 5 years ago, but they've been doing this work across generations. And I think that's where people are at their best, when they're actually situated in the local work, the local communities, and the local organizations where they are. And they're being led by them based on their expertise, their lived experience. So I think a immediate kind of call to action or thing you can do is look where you are and try to identify the people who are already doing the work. And I guarantee there's someone who's been doing it, and there's a community that's been sustaining that work across generations.
And you make a great point, Dr. Bishop, and we'll talk a little bit more about, a call to action on our next call, but it's definitely specific on where you are. So are there any specific organizations or movements that the both of you would advocate that young alumni in Philadelphia get involved with?
Well, great ones that right off the top of my head that are doing amazing work and again, have been doing this work is the Black Lives Matter Philly Coalition. There's the Philly kind of Radical Collective, which is a group of organizations and coalitions that are doing amazing work. There's the Black and Brown Workers Collective that is doing a lot of the work around the encampment that's down at the park. There's the Philly Tennis Union, which I think is leading an amazing fight around just stopping the mass evictions that people are facing right now during the pandemic. And again, have been doing that work for a while now. There's many more, but those are kind of the immediate ones that come to mind, who are doing work around criminal justice and prison abolition, doing work around housing and evictions, and doing work that, again, is in the community, that's local and has some type of history and understanding to it.
Yeah, I would just add, it's a really small group, but that I've been working with, which is DHS Give Us Back Our Children, which is connected to Every Mother is a Working Mother, and they're focused on some of the issues I mentioned about the foster care system, and working to create a different view of how to address the needs of children and families rather than taking children away.
And I'm sorry, Dr. Bishop.
One more org I wanted to shout out, because they're active right on Penn's campus, is Police Free Penn. And they're doing amazing work right now around really trying to first highlight the connections between the racist policing in wider Philadelphia and Penn's police force. And if you don't know, this summer, Penn's police force was involved in the crackdown on the uprisings, where they were, in the neighborhood where I live, they were, shooting tear gas aimlessly and really coming in a kind of a military fashion into this Black neighborhood. So Police Free Penn, again, is a coalition right on Penn's campus that's doing amazing work that I think young alumni can learn more about and be in solidarity.
Great, thank you both. And we spoke a little bit about policing at Penn. Speaking of that, Dr. Roberts, you are currently serving as the co-chair for the Penn Public Safety Review and Outreach Initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you are doing to promote kind of safety and equal belonging in and around campus?
So it is an outreach and review initiative that was commissioned by President Gutman as a way of getting input from the Penn community, as well as the surrounding West Philadelphia neighborhoods. And the goal of it is to re-envision public safety in a way where everyone feels they equally belong at Penn. And that prioritizes anti-racism and racial justice. We have just concluded 8 public hearings. At each one, we had 4 or 5 people from a variety of backgrounds from West Philly neighborhoods, staff, faculty, students at Penn. Last Tuesday, we had an entire hearing made up of students from Penn. Today we heard from 3 more students who are all involved very actively in public safety issues, especially alternatives to policing, to ensure safety for everybody. And so now we are writing up the review based on the hearings and also based on hundreds of documents that we've gotten from the the Division of Public Safety, and other information that people have submitted on the website. So you can submit on the website, if you Google Penn Public Safety Review and Outreach Initiative, the website will come up. And I don't want to give the wrong the wrong website, but it'll come up. And there's a place there where you can submit anonymously or identify yourself if you want, comments, statements, whatever information you want to us to take into account. And in addition to the report, we're going to recommend what the university should do in response to the review and to better ensure public safety for everybody, including our surrounding neighbors and everyone at Penn. They're, related to what we're talking about today. There was a consistent theme throughout of Black students saying that they felt that they did not belong in terms of public safety because of their being harassed or identified or misidentified by the police, feeling they had to wear Penn gear to avoid being stopped by the police or ask for IDs and that kind of thing. And that's one of the many concerns that we'll be addressing in our review. So I want to say that we haven't gotten any pressure from the university administration to have any particular sorts of recommendations or to gear our review one way or the other. We've been very independent and are hopeful that our recommendations will help to make change in terms of public safety on campus and in the West Philly community.
That's great. Thank you for your work on that. And you spoke a little bit about alternatives to policing. Could you elaborate on that a little bit and maybe offer some alternatives?
Well, so if, to me, the question, I don't think public safety means police. So the question is, what makes people safe? It's important for people to be physically safe and emotionally safe. And so what ensures that? And we know that police don't accomplish that. And so what would make us safe? And what would make us safe in a way that doesn't discriminate or devalue people within our communities? And so one aspect, now I feel I don't want to, I'm speaking now as an individual, not as a member of this initiative, because we haven't issued our recommendations yet. And so I don't want it to seem as if I'm stating recommendations in advance of our work. I'm co-leading this with Reverend Chaz Howard. And so his input is important as well. And so I don't want to speak out of turn about it without us concluding our report and recommendations, which will be public, and they're due October 1st. So we'll have that. But something that, so I got a couple ideas about alternatives, and we're really not talking about alternatives in the sense that it's just somebody else who's doing the same thing. This is something I've written about, that many people have said, well, instead of the police, call the child abuse hotline, or call health, whatever the Department of Human Services is. And as I've just been saying, they can act like police as well. So we really want to think about not just alternatives, but a re-envisioning of what safety means and how to accomplish it, and what welfare for and well-being mean. And so there's one important way of doing that is to focus on community resources and solidarity and collectives and mutual aid that can provide safety and resources for people without relying on the police. I mean, some work that I've done in terms of Black mothers is the way in which Black people in general, but if we're talking about gender-based violence, for example, we know that it is not safe for Black women to call the police to deal with violence in their homes. Many of the women who've been killed by police have been killed when they called police to respond to violence in their homes, or where family members have called the police and then their loved ones end up being assaulted or killed. And there's also evidence that it doesn't solve the problem at all. In fact, there's research that shows that for Black women, putting their male intimate partners in jail just makes the situation worse for everybody. In addition to which, we may not support putting more Black men in prison. I know I don't, so I don't want that to be what I rely on. So what do you rely on? And I noticed in the Q&A, there were some questions about that in terms of foster care as well. Well, our communities are resourceful and can be supported better. We can take money that's being spent on policing and put it into our communities to support the mutual ways in which people can hold each other accountable and can provide for the human needs and solve social conflicts. And that's what we have to work on. We don't have immediate answers to solve all the problems that prisons and police and foster care are supposed to be solving and aren't, but we can imagine and work toward, and right now, start implementing more humane and loving and compassionate and actually more effective ways of addressing our needs and our conflicts.
Great, and I think that transitions us really well to some of the questions in the Q&A that I want to get to. So Professor Roberts, this is for you. Robert says, I was wondering if there are any places in the US or around the world doing the kind of child welfare work that you describe, and if yes, what can we learn from them?
Yeah, well, so there's a couple ways I would answer that. One is, as I just said, around the country, there are mutual aid networks that are being formed. And again, I don't have the websites in mind, but if you just Google mutual aid, you will find some of these initiatives and networks that are being created to handle the needs of people in communities in a nonviolent, caring, compassionate, humane way. I mentioned DHS Give Us Back Our Children and organizations that have worked with them. And I think of those, in Philly as a kind of mutual aid. I mean, there are people in the community who come together to support each other in lots of different ways. And that makes people safer than calling the police to come in and deal with problems and needs, ineffectively, and sometimes ending with violence against the very people who are in need. So that's one way that I've seen mutual aid and forms of transformative justice that, instead of turning to the police, work within communities to deal with needs and conflicts. The other point I would make is that most nations around, well, I think probably every highly industrialized nation in the world has better safety nets and ways of publicly supporting families than the United States does. Having universal health care, having universal child care, having a higher minimum wage, a family wage that people can actually live on, having other ways in which poverty is reduced or eliminated. All of these kinds of social supports that most other nations in the world that have the kind of wealth that the US has, and even a fraction of that, are the kinds of big social programs that would eliminate the need to take children away from parents because the parents don't have the means to take care of them the way in which the state says they should. I want to point out that many families have their children taken away from them, not only because they don't have the material resources they need, but also just because of discrimination against poor and low-income people who are doing nothing different than wealthy people, but are treated very, very differently, like people with substance abuse problems. Poor people and people of color with those problems are treated harshly, whereas white middle-class parents who have substance abuse problems it's very unlikely their kids are going to be taken away from them. They have other resources to deal with those problems, which should be available to everybody. So those are some of the ways in which other nations have addressed these issues that are addressed so brutally and punitively in the United States.
Okay, thank you. And we have time for about one more question. Dr. Bishop, Rita wants to ask, how do you think Penn students, faculty, staff, and alumni could better support local schools and/or support more equitable and just education and schooling?
Great question. I think the starting point is really kind of a reorientation to how Penn and most, I think, members of the Penn community are kind of conditioned to answer that question, which is we need to launch a mentorship program, we need to launch an after school, a tutoring program, all these different kind of initiatives. And inherently, none of those things are bad, but none of them are necessarily getting at the root of some of these issues, is that local schools in Philadelphia are underfunded, that a part of that uneven allocation of resources or racial allocation of resources is because of the University of Penn and their history, and also their lack of paying fair or equitable taxes. And I think those type of kind of structural solutions have to also become a part of the vocabulary and actions that members of the Penn community are willing to fight for. So I think Penn loves to say, you know, the Netter Center is our example of how we're giving back to the community. And that's true, but there are structural issues that require some type of kind of structural solution. And that means reallocating those funds and resources from a place like UPenn that has such an abundance and putting that in the hands of community members who, from my vantage point, already know what it means to value Black children, to value Black schools. And they don't have to come in and learn that. That's something that they're living, fighting for, have been fighting for. And with the right resources and actual monetary funds, I think could do a better and transformative job with it.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we have time for actually one more question. We had a question in the chat about the permanence of racism. Dr., do you think that racism is permanent?
So I think the way I like to think about this question or idea of racism being permanent simply for me is yes, that racism is something that is a part of the US society, built into the foundation of how it operates. But I think that shouldn't be, you know, let's give up, it just is what it is. What that means is that a part of our struggle within ourselves, but also in solidarity with communities, is meaning that we have to constantly understand how racism is at play and be prepared and anticipating how we come up with countermeasures and really protections for the communities that we know are going to face these issues. I think that, you know, a quote I like to think about from Stokely Carmichael is that, you know, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's their problem. If they have the power to lynch me, that's my problem. So I think while racism may exist, while it may still remain in people's hearts and still remain in people's desire to implement in institutions and policies, a lot of what our battle is taking away that power to implement that racism, taking away that power to use your kind of devaluement of a group, to use that to do some type of harm or some type of repression. So a lot of it is that, yes, racism is here, but anti-racism has also always been here. The fight and freedom struggle from communities of color has also always been here. And we need to also see that as permanent and solidified and growing very strong.
I agree, and I think that really highlights the importance of young alumni getting involved in really fighting against racism and everything that's happening in our society. So I want to give a huge thank you to both Dr. Bishop and Dr. Roberts. Thank you guys for joining us in this conversation and sharing your thoughts and ideas to our young alumni audience, and for taking the time out of your schedule to speak with us about your views and about these issues that are pertinent in our nation.
I wanted to thank both Dr. Roberts, Dr. Bishop, and Michaela for moderating such a great, engaging conversation this evening. I know takeaways for me and kind of thinking about how the young alumni audience can get involved, what that looks like as we're navigating this time in our society. It's our hope through this series, The State of Our Society, that we're able to provide an opportunity to think critically and work through next steps for action. I encourage you to join us on Thursday, October 1st at 7:30 p.m. for the second part of The State of Our Society, a call to action. This event will feature Rita Hodges and Bianca Del Rio from the Netter Center for Community Partnerships, Dr. Valerie Swain K. McCollum, the Provost Distinguished Senior Fellow in the Graduate School of Education, and also Jude Darty, College 21, former acting University Assembly President and current class of 2021 Vice President of Finance, to chat about some of the student initiatives. There are a number of upcoming programs related to social justice that are offered by Alumni Relations and our university partners. I encourage you to visit alumni.upenn.edu/social-justice to learn more about what is coming up and to register to attend those events. On behalf of YPenn and Penn Spectrum programs, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much to Dr. Bishop, Dr. Roberts, and Michaela. and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you again.